Thomas Cromwell is on his feet in the House of Lords, and he is holding a folded piece of white silk. It is May, 1539. Henry VIII is not in the chamber. He does not need to be. What is being done here this afternoon is being done in his name, and it will be finished before supper. The woman the silk belonged to is not in the chamber either. She is 2 miles downriver, inside the Tower of London, and she has been there since March. Her name is Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. She is 65 years old. She is also the last of the Plantagenets, the royal house the Tudors took the throne from. Her father was George, Duke of Clarence. Her uncles were Edward IV and Richard III. She is godmother to the king's eldest daughter, and she ran that girl's household for most of her childhood. 30 years ago, this same king granted her a pension. 26 years ago, he made her a countess in her own right. She has not been charged in a court. She has not been arraigned. She has never been told, anywhere, by anyone, what she is accused of. She does not know what is in Cromwell's hands. The cloth is a tunic, white silk. Somebody has embroidered on it the 3 lions of England, and around them a wreath of flowers, pansies and marigolds. And somewhere on that silk, the badge of the 5 wounds of Christ, the emblem the northern rebels marched under 3 years ago, in the great rising they called the Pilgrimage of Grace. That is the case. That is the physical evidence against her. 1 garment. 6 months earlier, the king's officers went through her house at Warblington. Warblington, the great moated brick house in Hampshire she had built for herself. They were thorough. They were there all day, and the search worked. They found letters. They found papal bulls. They seized her goods and carried them away in carts. That search was not incompetent. This tunic was not on the list. But nobody in this chamber has to explain that, because this is not a trial. There is no jury. Nobody is sworn. Nobody is cross-examined. A bill in Parliament does not have to convince 12 men of anything. It only has to pass. And half the men in this room watched the ordinary machinery of English justice work perfectly well 6 months ago, in this same case. Her eldest son, Henry Pole, Lord Montague, was tried in Westminster Hall in December, heard the case against him, and was beheaded on Tower Hill. Her cousin, the Marquis of Exeter, the same. Sir Edward Neville, the same. 6 men, 6 trials, 1 month. Every man taken in this case got a courtroom. The paper on the table this afternoon puts her name in with theirs. A bill needs 3 readings. This is the 3rd. So there is a clock running in this chamber, and only the men in it can hear it. In a few minutes, a 65-year-old woman, in a cold stone room 2 miles east, who has never seen a judge, will be a dead woman in English law. Nobody has gone to tell her. Nobody will, until somebody decides it is convenient. Cromwell lifts the bundle, so the lords at the back can see it. He works a thumb under the top fold. The silk begins to open. To understand how a woman ends up killed by a piece of paper instead of by a verdict, you have to go back, not to that chamber, and not even to the arrests the year before, but 40 years, to a boy who went into that same tower at 10 and came out only once. This is not the story of a Catholic martyr, and it is not a costume tragedy about a wicked king. This is a case file. 2 years and 15 days pass between the sentence and the axe, and in that time, not one new piece of evidence is produced against her. 7 interrogations and 59 questions are put to the only witness the Crown has. 2 of the most powerful men in England spend a day in her own hall trying to break her, then write to Cromwell that they have got nothing. All of it survives. On paper, nobody assembled it in one place and read it forwards. By the end of this, you will know exactly why the king used a statute instead of a courtroom, and what that choice was built to destroy, because it was not her. This is Cursed Queens, where we take the women history called cursed, or mad, or barren, or traitors, and read the evidence back. If that is the history you came here for, the real record under the costume drama, subscribe and stay with me to the end, because the end is where this one turns. Now, the official story, and I want to give it to you at full strength, because it is stronger than you have been told. Margaret Pole was born on the 14th of August, 1473. Hold that date, we will need it. Into the losing side of a civil war. Her father was executed for treason when she was 4. Her brother Edward, Earl of Warwick, went into the Tower as a child of 10 because he had a better claim to the English throne than the man who had taken it. He came out at 24 in November 1499 to be beheaded. The Great Chronicle of London says it was done without any process of the law. 6 weeks later, the Spanish ambassador, Dr. de Puebla, wrote home to Ferdinand and Isabella with good news. With the last rival claimants dead, there did not remain a drop of doubtful royal blood in England. He was not condemning it. He was telling them it was now safe to send their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, into this family. That is the world Margaret grew up in. And the first Tudor solution to her was not the axe, it was marriage. Henry VII married the Plantagenet heiress downwards to Sir Richard Pole, a reliable Welsh gentleman with no royal blood at all, neutralised the bloodline by demoting it. And it worked. For 30 years it worked beautifully. When Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509, he granted her £100 a year. In 1513 he made her Countess of Salisbury in her own right, one of only 2 women in the kingdom holding a peerage that way. Remember that phrase, in her own right. It is going to matter enormously, and not in the way you think. In 1516, she stood godmother to the king's newborn daughter, Mary. In 1520, she was appointed lady governess of that child's household. The last Plantagenet in England was handed the raising of the heir to the Tudor throne. She was, in the phrase people used, a second mother to the girl. So here is the Crown's case, and here is why it is not stupid. By 1536, Margaret Pole's 3rd surviving son had become the most dangerous Englishman alive. Reginald Pole was a scholar Henry had personally paid to educate. In June 1536, he published a book. Its Latin title translates roughly as In Defense of the Unity of the Church, and from here I will simply call it the book. In it he denied the king's supremacy over the English church, called Henry a robber, a murderer, and a greater enemy to Christendom than the Turk, and called on the princes of Europe to depose him. That is not dissent. That is a printed solicitation of foreign invasion by an Englishman against his own king. In December that year the Pope made him a cardinal, which put him permanently beyond Henry's reach, and the family around Margaret was genuinely disaffected. Her eldest son Montague was heard saying he liked the king's conversation better than his conduct. Her cousin Exeter had a claim of his own. Her chaplain had fled abroad and gone straight to Reginald. This was a household in correspondence with a man who was, in law and in fact, an enemy of the crown. Then, in August 1538, the machinery started. Her youngest son, Geoffrey Pole, was arrested, and Geoffrey talked. On the 4th of November 1538, on what he said, the rest were taken. Montague, Exeter, Neville, and 3 lesser men. Write down that date. The 4th of November 1538. We are coming back to it, and when we do, it will not mean what it means now. In early December they were tried, not in secret, in Westminster Hall, before their peers, in the ordinary way. They heard the case. They were convicted, and on the 9th of December 1538, Exeter, Montague and Neville were beheaded on Tower Hill. The 9th of December 1538. Remember that one too. That date is going to detonate later, and it is going to take the entire official story with it. And when the officers searched her houses, they found things, letters, and papal bulls. Papal bulls, in England, in 1538, in the house of the mother of the cardinal who wanted the king deposed. Finally, The security problem was real. In March 1541, a conspiracy was uncovered in the West Riding of Yorkshire, the Wakefield conspiracy, serious, well-planned, cross-class, in a north that had already risen once. On the 26th of May, the French ambassador reported the king would ride into those counties with 4,000 or 5,000 horse instead of the usual 1,000. A regime that had spent 50 years killing rival claimants was not going to march north and leave the senior Yorkist bloodline alive in a fortress behind it. And the horror of the death itself? An accident. The ordinary executioner was out of London on the king's business. A substitute had to be found at short notice. He was young, and he was bad at it. That is not policy. That is an administrative failure on a summer morning. That is the official story. Dangerous family, real treason abroad, a confession from inside the household, 6 proper convictions, a genuine rising in the north, and 1 unlucky morning. Every part of that is true, and it is still not what happened. Because the Crown sent 2 men to break her, and those 2 men wrote back to Cromwell, privately, and told him exactly what they had found. That report survives, and it is the most damaging document in the case, and it was written by the prosecution. Before I read you what it says, if a case file about a 67-year-old woman is the kind of thing you want more of, the like button is the only thing that tells YouTube to go and find the other people who want it. That is the whole ask. Here is what they wrote. Tell number 1. The 12th of November, 1538. Warblington. 2 men ride up to her gate, Sir William Fitzwilliam, Earl of Southampton, the King's Lord Admiral, and Thomas Goodrich, Bishop of Ely. Ely. They are not junior officials. They are the heaviest instruments the Crown owns for this kind of work, and they have been sent to break a woman of 65 in her own hall. They question her before noon. They break and question her after noon. Their own phrase for how long they kept at it is, till almost night. Behind them, men go through her coffers and her chapel, and her carts are loaded in the yard. And on the 16th of November, Fitzwilliam and Goodrich sit down and report. They tell Cromwell she has been so earnest, so vehement, and so precise that they thought it a waste of time to press her further. They tell him, and this is a sentence written by 2 men who were trying to convict her, that they may call her rather a strong and constant man than a woman. Then they give him the 2 possibilities as they see them. Either her sons never told her anything at all, or she is the most arrant traitoress that ever lived. They put the innocent explanation first. Understand what that is. That is not a defense lawyer. That is the prosecution, privately, in writing, to the Chief Minister, at the end of a full day of pressure, reporting that it has nothing, and ranking her innocence as the likelier answer. The same dispatch encloses copies of her letters to Montague and to Reginald. They had read her mail. They still had nothing. That is 1. Keep counting. Tell number 2. Everybody else got a trial. Go back to that December. Montague, tried. Exeter, tried. Neville, tried. Crofties, Collins, Holland, tried. 6 trials, 1 case, 1 month, in the ordinary courts, and every one of them ended in the conviction the Crown wanted. The machine worked. The machine delivered. Margaret Pole was a peeress of England. She held the guaranteed right of trial by her peers. She never saw a court. Not once, not for a single hour of the 2.5 years between her arrest and her death. Hold those 2 facts against each other, because this is the whole film in 1 line. The state was not incapable of trying her. It had just run 6 trials in the same case. It declined to run hers. That is 2. And now look at the youngest son, because the price of the evidence is a person. Geoffrey Pole is arrested on the 29th of August, 1538. And then nothing happens to him. No questions. Not one. For nearly 2 months he sits in the tower, and nobody comes. That silence is not neglect. It is technique. 58 days engineered to soften a man before the first question is asked. The questions start on the 26th of October. In total, there are 7 interrogations and 59 questions. 7 and 59. That is the entire documented output of the state's effort against this family. After the first of those interrogations, Geoffrey Pole put a knife to his own chest. He survived. On the 28th of December, he tried again, with a cushion. 2 attempts, not 3. You will read 3, and 3 comes from an internet comment, not a record. 2. The Crown's only witness twice tried to stop being able to answer, and out of all of it, nothing chargeable against his mother ever emerged. If you have ever watched a family taken apart from the inside, one person pressured until they say the thing that damns everyone else, tell me below. I read every comment. Now back to it. Because there is one more person in the tower, and almost nobody talks about him. When they took Montague, they also took his son, Henry Pole the Younger, a boy of about 12. He is not charged. He is not tried. He is not accused of anything, at any point, ever. He is simply put inside, because of who his great-grandfather was. Henry paid for their keep. The Crown records a monthly food allowance, £13, 6 shillings and 8pence, and I will flag that the sum reaches us through later accounts, rather than a document I have read myself. But the structure of it is the thing. That single allowance covered 3 people, Margaret, her grandson, and Exeter's son Edward Courtenay, another boy. 1 old woman and 2 children of royal blood, kept alive on 1 line in a ledger. Remember the ledger. We are coming back to it, and it ends this film's saddest sentence. Now, tell number 3, and this is where the official story starts to come apart in your hands. Look again at the 9th of December, 1538. Montague, Exeter, and Neville, executed on Tower Hill. Tried, convicted, dead. Now look at the 12th of May, 1539. That is the day the Act of Attainder passes, the statute that names Margaret Pole. And it does not only name Margaret Pole, it also attaints Montague and Exeter, both of whom had been dead for 5 months. Read that again, slowly. The act ran 5 months after the bodies. Whatever else that statute was, it cannot have decided their guilt. Their guilt had been decided by a court. Their heads had come off, and the graves were cold. So what was it for? Why does a state that has already killed a man go back, half a year later, and pass a law about him? Hold that question. Do not answer it yet. It is the most important question in this case, and when I answer it, everything else you are about to hear will click into place at once. And note where Margaret's name sits, on the same act, in the same instrument, applied to men whose trials had already happened, and to one woman whose trial never would. That is 3. Tell number 4 is the Tunic. Come back to the chamber we started in, May 1539, 3rd reading, Cromwell on his feet, with the white silk in his hands, the 3 lions, the wreath of pansies and marigolds, the 5 wounds badge. Now put that against a date. The searches were in November 1538, exhaustive, all day, professional searches of a house she had built herself and lived in for 20 years. And I told you at the top, they worked. They produced letters. They produced papal bulls, genuinely awkward objects to own in England in 1538. The Tunic was not among them. It appears 6 months later, not in a search return, not in an inventory, not in a deposition. It appears in a man's hands, at the 3rd reading of a bill, in front of an audience with no power to test it, and nobody present with any interest in defending the woman it was about. It surfaced in the one venue in England where nobody could ask where it had been. Even the Victorian Dictionary of National Biography, no friend of Catholic martyrs, could not swallow it. Its phrasing is that Cromwell affected to see in this old raiment a traitorous connection with the pilgrimage of grace. Affected to see. That is a Victorian scholar calling it a performance. That is 4. Tell number 5 is what was actually on the cloth, and this is not opinion, it is heraldry, and heraldry is a language with rules. 3 Lions of England, her royal descent. She was a king's niece. She never hid it, and no law in England said she had to. Pansies. The pansy takes its name from the French word for thoughts, and a Tudor herald hearing it would hear the family name Pole. It is a pun, a rebus badge, the kind every great house used. It is a signature. Marigolds, Mary's gold, the badge of her goddaughter, the girl she raised. Assemble it, and the most incriminating object in the case says, royal blood and loyalty to Princess Mary. Exactly the 2 things Margaret Pole had asserted openly, in front of witnesses, all her life. The state's one exhibit is a statement of the only 2 loyalties she never bothered to conceal. And the 5 wounds? That is tell number 6, and it is the one that made me put down what I was reading and start again. Devotion to the 5 wounds of Christ was among the most popular in late medieval England. Lead pilgrim badges of it survive in quantity from 15th century London finds. It was ordinary. It was the crucifix on a chain of its day. And in 1511, 25 years before the Pilgrimage of Grace, an English commander named Thomas, Lord Darcy, took a force to Spain to fight the Moors, and his men wore 5 wounds badges. That expedition was licensed by Henry VIII. It is why Darcy still had a stock of them at Pontefract in 1536, when the North rose. So the rebels did not invent a treasonous emblem. They picked up a devotional one already lying around, one the king himself had signed off on men wearing on his own service a quarter of a century earlier. When Cromwell holds up that silk, he is holding an object that was legal to own for the entire life of everybody in the room, criminalized backwards by the man who had licensed it. That is 6. And feel where the count has got to. 6 tells, and not one of them is her doing anything. Every one is the state's own paperwork, in the state's own hand, describing the state's own conduct. Now into the Tower, because she is in there for 2.5 years, and something happens in those years that almost nobody mentions. Something few people seem to think about. She goes in March 1539. She is killed in May 1541. That is 2 complete winters and the beginning of a third, in an unheated stone lodging on the river, at 65, 66, 67. And we know she was cold, because it is in the Crown's own paper trail. She was, in the phrase that comes down to us, tormented in prison by the severity of the weather and the insufficiency of her clothing, she complained. The complaint is on record. Nobody answered it for 2 winters. That is a cold you cannot show anybody. It is not a wound. There is no picture of it. It is the sensation of a second winter arriving in a stone room before your hands have finished thawing from the first, in a body that is nearly 70, with no date on it, because a woman under sentence of Parliament has no release date to count towards. She had nothing to count towards at all. Which brings us to tell number 7, and it is the strangest thing in the entire file. On the 1st of March 1541, an order goes out for clothes. Not from her family is dead or in exile. The work is put to the Queen's own tailor. Catherine Howard's personal tailor makes, for the prisoner in the Tower, a furred nightgown, a furred petticoat, a kirtle, a bonnet and frontlet, 4 pairs of hose, 4 of shoes, and a pair of slippers. I want to be careful, because it is tempting to read that as kindness, and I do not think it is. Read it as an account. The state was maintaining a valuable body at its own expense, the way you maintain anything valuable you intend to keep. And here is the second thing you cannot show. To make those clothes, somebody had to measure her. A tape drawn across the shoulders, around the waist, around the neck. Somebody knelt on the stone floor of a cell in the Tower to fit shoes onto the feet of a woman who had been under sentence of death, by Act of Parliament, for 22 months, fitted by a man paid out of the same treasury that had sentenced her. There is no cruelty in that room. That is what makes it unbearable. It is competent administration, touching an old woman's shoulders. But run the dates. Furs on the 1st of March. Dead on the 27th of May. 11 weeks. That order is the hardest single piece of evidence in this film. It proves that in March 1541, the machinery of the English state had no plan to kill her. You do not commission a winter wardrobe for a corpse. Whatever decision ended her life was taken in the 11 weeks between the tailor and the block. That is 7. 7 tells. Hold all 7. If you have ever been punished for something you were born into, a family, a name, a face, a bloodline you did not choose and cannot resign from, tell me below. She was not the first, and she was not the last. Now the morning. The 27th of May, 1541. About 7 o'clock. Not on Tower Hill, where her son died in public in front of a city. Inside the Tower precinct, behind the walls. And there is no scaffold. I want to be precise, because you have seen it painted 100 times, and the painting is wrong. The ambassador's own words are that there was no scaffold erected, nor anything except a small block. Not a raised platform with steps, a low block on open ground. The ordinary executioner is not there. He is away in the north, doing his work. The record does not say which work, and I am not going to pretend it does. So a substitute is found. The emperor's ambassador calls him a garçonneau, garçonneau, a word for a lad, used with contempt. He is never named, his age is never given, he does not know how to do this. Here is the third thing you cannot show, and it is not the wound. I am not going to describe the wound, and no source describes it either. It is the room. By one account, the Lord Mayor of London is there, with about 150 people. There is no scaffold, so there is no height and no distance. They stand on the same ground she does. It is an enclosed yard, walls on 4 sides, at 7 in the morning, when a stone court is at its most acoustically bare. Whatever sound is made in there has nowhere to go, and nobody in that yard can step back, because there is nowhere to step back to, and because leaving is not permitted. 150 people were made witnesses to something the state had arranged very carefully so that nobody would see. She commended her soul to her Creator. She asked those present to pray for the king, for the queen, for Prince Edward, and for the princess, especially the princess, whose godmother she had been. She sent Mary her blessing and asked for hers. She was told to make haste and lay her neck on the block. She did. Then a boy who had never done this before was handed an axe, and he hacked her head and shoulders to pieces. That sentence is the ambassador's. It is not mine, and it is all we have. And now something about that morning that has nothing to do with Henry VIII, because it is the strangest discovery in this file, and it is about us. You almost certainly knew one fact about Margaret Pole before you clicked on this. You knew it took 11 strokes of the axe. It is on Wikipedia. It is in the documentaries, the novels, the podcasts, the listicles. It is the one detail everybody carries away. There is no source for it. Not a weak source. Not a contested source. None. It is not in the Imperial Ambassador's Dispatch, or the French Ambassador's, or the London Herald's Chronicle. It is not in the 1649 account by Lord Herbert of Cherbury, the man responsible for most of the legends attached to this death, including the famous defiant last line you may have heard, which he got from an informant he refused to name 108 years afterwards, and which the ambassador flatly contradicts. It is not in the Dictionary of National Biography of 1895, written by the scholar who had edited Henry's state papers line by line. It is not in the Catholic Martyrology of 1904, which had every motive to include it. Nothing before the 20th century counts strokes at all, and it gets worse. Wikipedia states it as fact, and footnotes it to a specific page range of the calendared Spanish state papers. Go to those pages. The number is not there. The citation is false. Follow the live trail back and it runs out. Not in an archive, but in a popular paperback published in 2011. Sit with what that means. The most famous thing about this woman's death, the number that makes it legible as an atrocity, was made up, recently, by us. Not by the Tudor state, by posterity. The state took her trial away from her. Then, 400 years later, we took her death away from her and replaced it with a number nobody ever counted. Everybody who has handled this woman has handled her slightly wrong. The church that made her a martyr in 1886 put her feast day on the wrong date. Both ambassadors aged her wildly. One called her 80 and more, the other nearly 90. She was 67, born the 14th of August, 1473. I told you to hold that date. The size of their error is the measure of their distance from the room. Neither man was there. There are no eyewitness accounts of this execution at all. So before I tell you what actually killed her, look at who is still alive on that morning. A cardinal in Italy, who does not know yet. Her grandson, in a cell inside the same walls, who will never be told. 3 answers have been offered for why she died on that particular morning, and every one of them has to get past those 2 people. Take them from the weakest up. The first, that she died for what her son Reginald was doing abroad, that his papal legation in 1541 provoked Henry past endurance, and she was the hostage who paid. This collapses on a calendar. Reginald's 1541 legation came in August. She died in May. You cannot retaliate in May for something that happens 3 months later. Picture the man himself when the news reaches him. His secretary, Ludovico Beccadelli, who wrote his life, records that Reginald said he had received good tidings, that he had always thought himself indebted to God for his birth from one of the noblest women in England, and that his obligation was now greater because he was the son of a martyr. Then he went away alone for about an hour, and came back as cheerful as before. That is a man receiving news, not a man who provoked it. The second, that there was a plot to rescue her from the tower, and the regime moved first. You will find this everywhere. There is no primary source for it, not a contested one. None has ever been located. It is not a weak theory. It is a rumor repeated until it acquired the texture of a fact, which on this topic we have just watched happen. And the third, which is the serious one, and deserves real respect, that there is no reason at all. That Henry by 1541 was simply a capricious and dangerous man. The ambassador Castillon had already called him the most dangerous and cruel man in the world, in a fury, with neither reason nor understanding, and that she died because a king was in a rage, on no schedule, for nothing. Everything in that is defensible. He was capricious. And I have to be honest about the limits of the record. Not one contemporary source states a motive for the timing of her execution. Not one. But look at what caprice cannot do. Caprice cannot explain why that morning, not any of the roughly 900 mornings she had lain under sentence, that one. And on that same morning, out of that same tower, 3 of the Yorkshire conspirators, Lee, Tattersall and Thome, were dragged to Tyburn. 10 more were hanged, drawn and quartered at York for the same treason. Her death was not a solitary act of rage. It was an item on the same morning's schedule as the Wakefield reprisals. A week later, the Privy Council was deciding what to do with Sir John Neville of Chevet, the man at the centre of that Yorkshire plot. The standard reference work on that Parliament states it flatly. The Council decided against executing him at the same time as the Countess of Salisbury's execution, which the conspiracy had precipitated. They sent him north instead, and he died at York on the 15th of June. I will grade that link honestly. Once, the rising as the trigger is a strong inference resting on tight juxtaposition plus that one flat assertion. It is not a confession, but it is the only thing on the table that explains the date. Caprice explains the king. It does not explain the schedule. And here is where the fourth theory really fails, and it is not close. The instrument that killed her was not chosen on the 27th of May 1541. It was chosen 2 years earlier. An Act of Parliament has to be drafted, read 3 times, carried through both houses, and given the royal assent. That is not a man losing his temper. That is a man doing paperwork. So, 2 questions have been sitting on the table this whole film, and they have the same answer. Why did the king, who had 6 working courtrooms in this very case, refuse to give her one? And why did Parliament bother to attaint 2 men who had already been executed 5 months earlier? The answer is a single sentence, written in cipher, by a Frenchman, on the 5th of November, 1538. Go back to the 4th of November, 1538. I asked you to write it down. That is the day they arrested Montague, Exeter and Neville, the day the conspiracy case officially begins. The very next day, the French ambassador in London, Castillon, sat down to report those arrests to the Constable of France, and the first thing he reached for was not the charges, it was a memory. He wrote that it was a very long time since this king had told him that he wished to exterminate this house of Montague, which still belongs to the White Rose, and the house of Pole, of which the cardinal is a member. Read it again. A very long time since, the king told him. Not a rumour, not a report, a conversation. Exterminate. Castillon wrote it in cipher, in French, exterminer, and he did not write it as a rumour he had picked up somewhere. He wrote it as a word he had been handed to his face by the king, and it is not the softer phrase you may have heard attached to Henry. That one appears in no source at all. And look at what he names. Not a plot, not a treason, a letter, a meeting, a plan, a crime. He names a house and a rose. The White Rose is not an act. The White Rose is a bloodline. You cannot commit it. You cannot renounce it. You cannot be innocent of it. That is the charge. And the king had spoken it out loud, to a foreign diplomat, a long time before anybody in England went looking for evidence. Now run the scoreboard again, all 7, through that one sentence. 1. The 2 interrogators who spent a whole day on her got nothing and ranked her innocence first. Of course they had nothing. There was nothing to find. They had been sent to justify a decision already taken, and being competent men, they came back and said so. 2. 6 trials in 1 month, and no trial for her. A trial requires an accusation a court can test. There was no accusation, there was a bloodline. 3. The attainder that ran 5 months after the bodies. In a moment you will know why they bothered. 4. The Tunic, absent in November, and in Cromwell's hands in May. Of course it appeared late. The decision came first. The evidence was commissioned afterwards, in the one room where nobody could ask where it had been. 5. The heraldry on it. Royal blood. Loyalty to Mary. Never an accusation of treason. A picture of her descent. In the most literal sense, a picture of the White Rose. 6. The badge Henry himself had licensed men to wear in 1511, criminalized backwards because the object never mattered, only whose coffer it could be said to come from. 7. The furs in March, 11 weeks before the axe. Not a contradiction, a confirmation. In March 1541, there was no plan to kill her, because no plan was ever needed. There was a standing sentence, passed 2 years earlier, requiring nothing further of anyone, waiting only for a convenient morning. Yorkshire supplied the morning, the Act supplied everything else. 2 years and 15 days between the sentence and the axe, and the state papers for 1541 contain no new evidence against her at all. Nothing was discovered, nothing was proved. The 1539 Act was simply switched on. Which brings us to the last question, and the answer is why this is not just another Tudor cruelty story. Why an Act of Attainder at all? Because of what an attainder uniquely does, and this is the hinge of the whole case. An attainder is not a verdict, it is a statute. It bypasses indictment, arraignment, trial by peers, the right to hear the evidence and to answer it, and every rule of evidence there is, because Parliament is not a court and does not pretend to be. One historian of Henry's parliaments called Attainder the characteristic instrument of Tudor policy. That is what it is, an instrument chosen for a job. And here is the job. An attainder produces something no execution can produce. It produces corruption of blood. Say it slowly, corruption of blood. The attainted forfeits what they hold. They cannot inherit, and, this is the part that matters, they can transmit nothing, not land, not title, not a claim, not to a son, not to a grandson, not to anybody, ever. The line is not punished, the line is legally extinguished. Now put that against something I asked you to remember half an hour ago. In 1513, Henry made her Countess of Salisbury in her own right, and a title held in her own right is a title that transmits. He built something heritable in 1513, then needed an Act of Parliament in 1539 to make it unheritable forever. So here it is. Henry did not need Parliament to kill an unarmed woman of 67. He had the Tower, a block, and a boy with an axe. Killing her was administratively trivial. He needed Parliament for the other thing. He needed Parliament to reach into the blood of the House of Clarence and make it legally incapable of ever transmitting a claim to the English throne again. An execution kills a person. Only an attainder kills a line. That is why they went back, 5 months after Montague and Exeter were in the ground, and attainted 2 dead men. The deaths were never the point. The heirs were the point. The trials disposed of the bodies. Only the act could dispose of the bloodline. The choice of tool is the confession of motive. If the target had been her conduct, a trial would have served. The state ran 6 in this same case, and won every one. Only the blood required a statute. And we know it was the blood, because the king had said so. A house and a rose, long before there was anything to accuse her of. She was not killed for what she did. There is no surviving allegation of a single thing she did. She was killed for what she could pass on. And this is the part that should make you angry, because it worked. It worked so completely that we cannot even find her now. Her family's burial priory at Bisham had been dissolved by Henry 4 years earlier, so there was no family ground left to put her in. She went into the little chapel inside the walls of the fortress that killed her, St. Peter ad Vincula, and no contemporary source records the burial at all. Warblington, the house she built herself, is now 1 stair turret and a fragment of wall in a field. Even her face is uncertain. The portrait usually printed as hers hangs in the National Portrait Gallery, labelled Unknown Woman, formerly known as Margaret Pole, and the bones. In October 1876, the Victorians opened the chancel of that chapel and found, near the altar, the remains of a tall, elderly woman, the only elderly woman ever executed and buried there. You have already met that dig, in the ground, in another file. It is the same excavation we walked through in the Anne Boleyn episode on this channel, and everything said there about how disturbed those burials were applies here. It is probable. It is not proven. Hilary Mantel put it better than I can. Writing in 2017, she said this is what Margaret is now, besides paper and ink and the ruins of her palaces, pieces of breastbone and pelvis, a single finger bone, and 4 vertebrae. Now the ledger. I said we would come back to it. That 1 monthly allowance covered 3 people, an old woman and 2 boys. She died in May 1541, and in 1542, the payments for her grandson, Henry Pole the Younger, never charged, never tried, never accused, simply stop. There is no warrant, no mourning, no block, no chronicle entry. He was put in the Tower at about 12 because of who his great-grandfather was, and then a clerk stopped writing his name down. That is how the last Plantagenets end. Not on a scaffold, in an account book, mid-column, with no line drawn under it. So imagine this. Imagine being 67 and knowing that nothing you did was ever the problem. Imagine being told all your life that you had been forgiven for your father, pensioned, raised to a peerage in your own right, handed the king's daughter to bring up, called a second mother to a princess. Imagine believing it, because they gave you every reason to. Imagine two men filling your own hall for a whole day, finding nothing, and saying so, and it changing nothing. Imagine 2 winters of cold, and a complaint nobody answers. Imagine a tailor kneeling to measure your feet in March, and taking from it that somebody has decided you are worth keeping, and never being told that a paper signed 2 years ago has already ended you, and all that remains is for a morning to become convenient. And imagine that your last recorded act, on open ground at 7 in the morning, in front of 150 people not allowed to leave, was to ask them to pray for the king who was killing you, and to send your blessing to the girl you raised. So where do you land? Was she a casualty of a real security crisis in a dangerous year? Was she the victim of a king's personal cruelty, and the rest only the paperwork cruelty generates? Or, as I think, was she the last installment on a debt the Tudors opened in 1499, settled with the one instrument in English law that kills a bloodline instead of a body? Tell me where you land and why. I read every comment, and this is exactly the argument I want to have down there. Next, I am opening the file on Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, remembered as the sister-in-law who helped send Anne Boleyn to the block, and who went to the block herself beside Catherine Howard. Before they could kill her, Parliament had to change the law, because of what the court had already said out loud about the state of her mind. They changed it anyway. Everyone tells that story wrong. I won't. I will see you in the next one. If this changed how you see her, if the 11 strokes you thought you knew look different now, subscribe, so the next case finds you. And tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city or your country below. It never stops amazing me how far these stories travel. They were never cursed. They were never mad. They were never barren. They were women the record was afraid of. And the file is finally open.